Hi, this is Marty Duran. Everyone realizes we're living in uncertain times and that life is changing faster than many people can process it. In uncertainty, the question people must always ask is, how do I understand and how should I respond? That's one of the main reasons I wrote The Disparate Ones, essays on being in the world but not of the world. The 17 essays in this short volume will both challenge you to think well during these times and, I believe, leave you encouraged about facing these times. Purchase The Disparate Ones now wherever you order books.
On today's edition of Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards. Our guest for this episode is Tony Stewart. Tony's new book, Carrying the Tiger, chronicles the tender, joy-filled moments he shared with his wife, Lynn, the devastating loss he endured when she died from cancer, and his path to embracing his new life. His courage and fortitude will inspire and encourage you.
The simplest and yet most profound is to realize that life is precious, life is short, and not just our human life, but the nature all around us. And if we go through our lives not paying attention, we miss the beauty that surrounds us every day, and we miss many possibilities for joy.
Let's join today's heartfelt episode with author Tony Stewart.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. Our guest today is filmmaker and software developer, Tony Stewart. Hello, Tony, and thank you for being here today.
Hi, Melvin. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Before we begin, I just want to say I'm sorry for your loss. Lynn seems like she was a wonderful woman.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate that. And I agree with you. She was a wonderful woman. If she hadn't been, I probably wouldn't have written the book.
No, you and your wife's name was Lynn Katula. You and Lynn traveled extensively in India and Southeast Asia, staying in small hotels off the beaten path and eating exotic food with your fingers. Do you think you'll ever return to those places someday?
Do you know, I've wondered that. I'm in another relationship now, and we talk about traveling someday, and I kind of want to show her some of the places where Lynn and I had those wonderful experiences. On the other hand, life is short and full, and we keep finding other things that we need to do. And there is a sense that you can't go back again, as the famous title of a book many years ago said, that you try to go back to the places where you had the wonderful experiences. Maybe you'll love it, or maybe you're going to spend the whole time saying, I don't like how it changed here, and not being able to recapture the magic from the first visit.
Yes. All right. April is Worldwide Bereaved Spouses Awareness Month. And your book drops today, April 29, 2025. Congratulations on completing your first book. It's called Carrying the Tiger, Living with Cancer, Dying with Grace, and Finding Joy While Grieving. How did you come up with the title, Carrying the Tiger?
So that's a really interesting story. I started this book, or rather, this book began as a series of posts on a website called Caring Bridge, which is a nonprofit organization website where you can set up like a little mini private Facebook-y thing to keep in touch with your friends and family. And we started it just a few days after Lynn's diagnosis as having incurable cancer. So we reached out to a number of our friends and we told them what was going on. And I would post there regularly every couple of days. You know, we saw this doctor, we saw that doctor. These are the things that are happening. That was the start. But one of those posts reached a friend of Lynn who wrote back an email saying, I really want to support you. In our Tai Chi group, we carry tigers for friends who are facing difficult challenges. The three motions of bending low, lifting the tiger, and putting it on a hilltop far away make that tiger less threatening, because a tiger on a hilltop far away isn't so scary. And Lynn wrote back to her friend and said, "That's beautiful. Would you please teach me how to carry tigers?" So that's where the title came from. I have to say, I had written the book and been scratching my head trying to come up with a title for it for about 6 months when I suddenly realized that anecdote, which was in the book the whole time, was the perfect title, because we have in Carrying the Tiger being the title, and then the 3 sections of it: living with cancer, dying with grace, finding joy while grieving, each of which was different in a way, and each was its own tiger to face and carry, and its own challenge.
Okay, let's talk about that here. Let's go with those 3 parts, if you don't mind giving us the description of how you came up with that.
No, I don't mind at all. The book, basically, the 3 parts of the book are, of course, what happened to us. I probably would never have written this book if I hadn't been writing all of those journals on Caringbridge, which were never intended at the time to be read by other people. And although they're in the book is a lot more than those journals. But as Lynn and I traveled through the twists and turns of finding the right doctors and then the right treatment for her cancer, and then all these complicated setbacks and side effects and things that happened, the posts got more interesting, and the story felt like we were on a roller coaster. But I still probably would never have thought of sharing it with the world if it hadn't continued through the next 2 phases. We had very good luck. Lynn got into an experimental clinical trial with some drugs that held down her cancer for 5 or 6 years. When we first saw the doctors, they said basically 6 months to 2 years is the range. And that's what we were facing that first day. But in fact, she got to live 5 or 6 more years, which were amazing and wonderful years for us and brought us much closer together than we had ever been before. But then eventually, as happens with just about any incurable cancer, unless you have some amazing good luck and find exactly the right experimental treatment that does it for you, the cancer mutates. And as it did with Lynn, it mutates, it beats the drugs, and the drugs stop working. And then the tumors got out of control, and we were now down to the same 5 or 6 months that we thought we were going to have at the very beginning. Those were very difficult. We ultimately decided no more treatment. There's no point in continuing. The tumors are growing. The treatments are becoming incredibly painful. The side effects are painful. Let's stop. So that led to the second part of our journey, which was actually only a few weeks, which was home hospice. And Lynn came home, and we set up hospice here in the apartment, and I took care of her for those 2 weeks. It did have a home health aide come in and then later too, but it felt like being alone with her, and this was during COVID, I should say, so that we had hardly any visitors. And those were some of the most special times of my entire life. It was a beautiful, grace-filled experience. But I found myself waking up at 3 a.m. full of these stories that I wanted to tell of what it had felt like that day. So I was writing posts about what it felt like for me to go through this experience and what it was like for Lynn, or at least as far as I could tell, the words she was saying, the conversations we were having, knowing that she was going to die. And then she did die. And I naively thought that because hospice had gone so well and we had been able to talk about it and we told each other how much we loved each other, she had even given me permission to find another girlfriend at some point. You couldn't ask for more. I naively thought, oh, maybe my grief will be shallower or shorter than other people. And I wrote a post saying, I guess this will be the last post because Lynn died and this was the Lynn Catula story, and I'm going to go on with the rest of my life. And 2 days later, I couldn't stop myself. I wrote another post saying, this grief is overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And I kept writing. I had become addicted to writing these posts about what I was feeling as I went through, over a period of months and then years, coming out of the grief and then having another relationship and finding a way to integrate it into my life. And all that time, friends who were reading Caringbridge kept saying, keep writing, Tony. I love reading what you're writing. It's helping me. Which ultimately is what caused me to decide to turn all of that into a book, although it wasn't until several years later that I was able to do it.
And what about the finding joy part? How did you find joy during this?
Well, there are several aspects to it. the most obvious answer is that most of the last part of the book is about how I met another woman while I was still deeply grieving Lynn. And I should say that I met a woman who was 1,200 miles away from me, and I didn't know what she looked like at first, except maybe a Facebook post. And we connected over grieving. It's a kind of a long story with coincidences in it of how we came to be talking to each other. But we were talking to each other about our shared grief. I mean, she was having her grief, I was having mine, but what it was like to be grieving. And we started falling for each other. And one day she said, here we were talking about kind of how hard it was to get through the day. And she suddenly stopped and said, "Tony, are you feeling what I'm feeling? Because I've got a big crush on you," which is one of the bravest things anyone ever said to me, to put herself out there like that. And I had to admit, yeah, I did too. And at that point, I was still planning Lynn's memorial. I loved her deeply. I was carrying her in my heart and crying for her tons all day long. And I started to have this seed of attraction for someone else. And that made me feel terribly guilty, was terribly complicated. It took a couple of years for that to play out. But she was the big joy that came into my life. And the complexity of trying to navigate our new relationship, integrate it with my love for Lynn, and find a way to see, were we going to stay together, and how would we make this work? That's the big story. But the smaller story, which actually is all through the book, is even while all of these difficult things were happening to us, we, Lynn and I, became more attuned to the beauty and all around us, and to joyful moments that we could have together than we had probably ever been in our life up till then. So the entire 8 or so years that are covered by the book are about finding those moments of joy and grace and beauty that are all around us that we in our busy lives just zoom past. But when you know that your beloved wife's life has a time limit on it, at least in our case, we started noticing those things and catching those moments of joy as they came by.
During Lynn's course of treatment and your interactions with the medical community, what were some of the more frustrating and gratifying experiences for you?
Ooh. I would say that the most frustrating single thing that happened, and it was fairly early on, was when we discovered how siloed our medical community is, the American medical system. We had been referred I live in New York City, and we had been referred for a second opinion to a friend of mine at Yale New Haven Hospital in New Haven, which is several hours drive from here, or public transit. And we went up there thinking that we would get some advice on what we could do about this. And instead, much to our lovely surprise, they said, "We're running a clinical trial here that we think would be perfect for Lynn. We'd like to sign you up." But as we learned more about it, as with many clinical trials I've later learned, it was going to be incredibly intensive. We were practically going to have to move to New Haven, camp out in a hotel room there for weeks. And I had a full-time job in New York. So we were frustrated, and we said, "Is this available anywhere else?" And they basically said, "That's up to you to find out." And then I got out my phone, or actually they turned a computer to face me. They gave me a computer to use. Weird. They gave me a computer to use. I Googled it, and I immediately discovered that at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City, where I live, one of the world's most famous cancer hospitals, they're running basically the same clinical trial. So I turned to the nurse who's helping us there in New Haven, and I say, "Can you call your counterpart in New York and find out whether they have slots in this trial?" Because we didn't want to give up on a precious chance to do this in New Haven if there weren't any slots in New York. And the nurse turned to me and said, "I'd love to, but I wouldn't know who to call. You're on your own. It's up to you to make whatever calls you need to make."
Wow.
Which was incredibly surprising, confusing. And I should say, I liked these people. I mean, these are great doctors, great nurses. It's a New Haven, terrific hospital. And I have nothing against them, but it was something about the system. And we kept finding that even within Sloan Kettering later on, that different parts of it were siloed. And we had to communicate with each one separately and pull all the pieces together for a long time until we figured out how it worked. That was all incredibly frustrating and very surprising, considering that we liked our doctors. The most gratifying thing was probably that the doctors we had and we stayed with were wonderful, caring, warm people who helped us out in ways that we hadn't anticipated. Most importantly, not so much in the ways they were treating us, which was very important, but emotionally, the hardest thing for us to come to understand was that when you have a stage 4 cancer for which there is no cure, which is most stage 4 cancers are like that, if you can just hold the tumors down and keep them stable, you are winning the game for the time being. We went into this thinking, oh, okay, great. We're going to take this clinical trial, this immunotherapy thing. We're going to take these drugs. If we're lucky, they'll blow the tumors away. And they didn't. What they did was they kept them from growing. And they continued to keep them from growing for 5 years. But it took us months of these doctors explaining to us and holding our hands again and again that stable is winning when you have that kind of cancer. And ultimately, they helped us appreciate that and live our lives to the fullest over those 5 or 6 years in ways that I'm not sure we would have found that on our own. It was tremendously helpful. Now, I should say that during those same 5 or 6 years, the way we even knew about this cancer was that it had attacked Lynn's spine. It was lung cancer, non-smoker's lung cancer, but it had attacked her spine and damaged her spine. The very first thing we had to do before we even saw an oncologist, well, the first oncologist like that day said, you need to go see a neurosurgeon today because if that tumor in your spine keeps growing, you're going to be paralyzed. So the first part of our trip was about solving that and dealing with that tumor. And then it was the gift that kept on giving. We kept having, Lynn had multiple spinal operations, all kinds of twists and turns coming from that. During the same 6 years that we weren't, during the same 6 years that her lung tumors were not growing, and if only that had been the whole story, those would have been wonderful. 3 or 4 of those years had all kinds of complicated twists and turns and medical involvement, which is in the book, Carrying the Tiger. We don't need to go into all of that here, but it's a complicated story with a lot of twists and turns, even when the cancer was being held down.
Well, suffering and death and grief and recovery are difficult topics to discuss, obviously. I'm sure you heard some comments from well-meaning people that may have been inappropriate. And I'm sure once you started a new relationship, you probably really heard some things. What are some things that people have said to you? And what do you suggest? What do you advise people to say to someone in a situation that they may not understand?
I think the most important thing is not to project onto the person. I mean, here we have these 3 parts of my story. The most obvious one where this comes up is in grief, is when people expect you to get through your grief on some kind of time frame, to cry or not cry, to behave in some way or another. And I think but it's true of living with cancer too. The most important thing is not to project onto the person who's going through the experience how you think it should be, but rather to let them tell you, to the extent they want to, what they're going through. I would ask open-ended questions like, well, what does it feel like? Rather than, how do you feel, as in, are you feeling good today? And certainly with grief, the single most important thing that I wish people had asked me, it took me a while to figure it out, is to talk about Lynn. We're all so shy about it. And I'm sure my friends didn't want to bring up pain in me, but I found pretty quickly that I missed it, that I had dinner with friends within a week after Lynn died, dear friends who had me over for dinner, a lovely gesture. I ended up seeing them many times. They had me for dinner once a week for about 6 weeks in the early grief. But it was several times before I got up the courage to say to them, I'd really like to talk about Lynn. Because we had all managed to completely avoid saying anything about her. And when we did, oh my God, it was so healing for me. Just they told me a few of the things they loved about her. They'd known her for 30 or 40 years. And I got to say a few things. And that is something that I think we can give to our friends who are grieving, is an offer to talk about the person they've lost.
All right. So why is it so important for you? Why was it so important for you to keep your friends informed throughout Lynn's and your journey?
Oh, that turned out to be huge, and we discovered it by accident. Lynn had a lot of friends, and it never occurred to us to keep this a secret from them. But I certainly didn't think I was going to find myself sharing all of the emotions that I was experiencing. So just a few days in, we set up this Caring Bridge posting situation. We told our friends, if you want to follow along, log into Caring Bridge, and here's the access to our private site, and we'll let you know there. So first, it was tremendously useful to us simply to be able to put in one place the information about what was going on and have people see it. But second, they started writing comments. And a lot of those comments, I mean, it's just like Facebook or Instagram or something. You get a place to write comments. It's very simple, though. No ads. A lot of those comments were very basic, sort of like, I feel for you, or so sorry to hear what you're going through, or fingers crossed, or, whatever. And even those mundane, simple gestures of support were incredibly helpful to us. We came to thrive on these things. We would put up a post. I wrote all the posts, but Lynn would look over my shoulder, make sure that it was what she wanted me to say and not more. And she had me cut some references to her pain and some of the messy side effects, which, by the way, I've put back in the book. But at the time, she didn't want people to feel sorry for her. But we quickly discovered that after we posted one, starting within a few minutes, comments would begin to appear. And we would sit at the computer and press the refresh button on the browser, because in those days, Caring Bridge didn't auto-refresh, to see these things coming in. And it was like being surrounded by love and support and feeling like we were part of a community that was just buoying us along and helping us. So that carried on, and that's how I got addicted to writing the posts. Then later, they became part of my therapy. I would not have known to use the word at the time, but looking back at it, you can see the journey of my posts as I start putting in more and more about what I was feeling, what it felt like to try and support someone through this really difficult process of learning to live with cancer and all the operations and things, and how brutal it was on me, which you discover, as I discovered after about a year in, and when I had a kind of a mini breakdown. And then later on, when Lynn was dying, what it felt like to be with someone who's dying and to help her have a good death. And then later on, when I was grieving, it was almost as if I'd been in a grief group, and I was writing these posts to my friends as if it were my turn in some kind of grief group where you'd go around the room and everyone would get to say what was going on to them and no one would interrupt. Those were what the posts became for me. So they were hugely important to us on multiple levels. And I almost left out that some of our friends had been through these kinds of experiences before, and they would write comments that were genuinely useful and sometimes fascinating, but like, oh yeah, when I had hospital delirium, this is what it felt like to me. Lynn went through a period where she became delirious from being in the hospital for so long, which happens to people, but no one had told me about that. I was scared to death. And then there's a friend saying, oh yeah, when I was in the hospital for the third time, I started to imagine this, that, and the other. And it made it a little less scary for me. And other people would tell us, yeah, oh, you're on that painkiller? Well, here's what I found. These were all, useful and interesting and supportive. I never imagined that we would get so much back from being that open with our friends. And then ultimately it led to the book, Carrying the Tiger. There wouldn't be a book now if it hadn't been for those posts and for the responses from our friends telling me to keep going and telling me, this is really special. I'm really glad you're sharing this. People don't share this kind of stuff. People don't write about what they're feeling in real time when they're going through deep grief, or when it's hospice and your wife is in the process of dying and you're still able to talk to each other. They told me, you've got something very special here. My friends did. And so ultimately, when I was emotionally ready for it, I wrote the book. All because of those posts.
Wow. So what were the challenges in converting those posts into a book?
I'd say there were two sets of challenges. The first was simply there were 700 pages of posts and comments. When I printed those posts out, they came to 700 pages, which was a ton. There's a lot of fluff. There's a lot of repetition. You go to the same kind of doctor's appointment 4 times in a row. There were a lot of repeated comments and just the ones, all the supportive ones that kind of blur into each other after a while. So the first challenge was simply to edit all of that down and find out what would this story be like if I took out the repetition and if I just strung these posts together to see what kind of story did they tell on their own. Challenge number 2 was, okay, I did that. I kind of loved the result. And I quickly realized that no one would read it unless they were already a good friend of ours, because it didn't explain who we were or why you should care. So second pass through this, which took months, the whole process took 14 months, converting those posts into a book. The second, much longer pass was going back and filling in all these things that I had left out, including flashbacks, how Lynn and I met, the travels that we took, things that would let you get to know us as people. But also, when I said we had left out, she had asked me to leave out, like, oh, I don't know, the fact that she was having diarrhea, the uncontrollable diarrhea, including in a public place because of the drugs she was taking for a while, or the level of pain she was experiencing, because, again, she didn't want her friends to pity her. But when you are reading someone's memoir, it's exactly those kind of details that make it real and relatable. And if the author of the memoir glosses over them, you kind of get bored. I don't need euphemisms. I want to know what happened and what it felt like. So the second pass was putting those kinds of things in, which made the story immensely more interesting. And then the third, which came to me rather late, was coming to understand that this is my story, not Lynn's. That a memoir is inherently the story of the person who's writing it, whose voice you're reading, whose thoughts you're experiencing. I had, of course, done most of the Caringbridge posts up until the day she died as Lynn Catula Caringbridge Journal. And then some of my early readers, so after my second pass of the book last fall, I sent it out to a bunch of what are called beta readers, people who didn't really know me or Lynn, to see, have I got something here? Is it worth continuing? Is it worth trying to publish this book? And several of them said they were confused because they thought it was my story, and then it kept going after Lynn died. And some others told me that was actually the most interesting part of the book, the grieving and coming out of it. Everyone had different ideas about what was their most interesting part of the book. But I took this to heart, and I went back and I went through the whole book a third time to say, wait a minute. How do I make this my story? How do I own this as my story that I'm sharing with the world? And in some ways, that was emotionally the hardest part, because I had done it as a labor of love for Lynn. And I haven't written a book before. I'm a kind of a shy guy internally. I call myself a cheerful introvert. And here I was putting myself out there on the page for all to see. But I did it. And the readers of the people who've read early drafts of the latest version tell me they're really glad I did. That it just became a lot better once I took ownership of the story.
That sounds great. All right. So why was it important for you to have the arc of the book extend 3 years beyond Lynn's death?
Two reasons. One, I did originally try to write this book just a few months after Lynn died. That's when I printed out the 700 pages. And I sat there and I looked at them for, a week or so, making little useless notes in the margin. And I was completely incapable of doing it. I was too grieving. Just looking at these memories in print of what we had been through in the journey was making me cry, and I couldn't distance myself enough to write it. So then I put it down, and that damn box sat on the floor of my office for the next 3 years, where I kept kind of bumping into it. And it kept saying to me, there's a book here waiting for you. But eventually, when I did feel ready to write it, I realized that the fact that during the 2 or 3 years after Lynn died, I met this other woman and had these experiences of coming out of my grief gave the story a satisfying arc that it wouldn't have had if it just ended, she died and I grieved a lot and it's over. And there are books like that. There are very good books like that. But this one, for me, tells a story that is more complete in the way that real life works. It starts on the day that we discover, oh my goodness, our life as we knew it is over. Lynn has these tumors. What does this mean? And it goes through the whole process of learning to deal with that, living with cancer, the doctors, all of those things. Then the home hospice, dying with grace. Then, as happens in real life, your life goes on after your loved one dies, and you have to deal with those emotions. And somehow, over some period of time that varies for everyone, find your way back into the experience, being able to enjoy your life, being able to have experiences, being able to remember the beautiful person you lost without every memory paralyzing you with tears. And so the book covers that process too. And therefore, I think it reflects real life. It has a much more satisfying ending because you see me stumbling my way towards new love. And I just think it's a better story.
What does it mean to you to live and love with your whole heart?
Several things all at once. The simplest and yet most profound is to realize that life is precious, life is short, and not just our human life, but the nature all around us. And if we go through our lives not paying attention, we miss the beauty that surrounds us every day, and we miss many possibilities for joy. And that's a lot of what I've tried to include in the book is these lovely moments where I become aware of this wonderful thing, this wonderful world we live in, this wonderful life we have. In the bigger sense, when we get to the last part of the book, what I had to learn was how to hold Lynn in my heart while also making room for a new love, which was very complicated and very confusing. But ultimately, the book ends not when I've succeeded in that process. I mean, this is 2 years later now as you and I are talking, and I would say that process is still ongoing. But it ends when you can see that I'm finding my way forward. And this, for me, is the fullest sense of living fully. I'm carrying Lynn in my heart. I could not ever let go of her. I mean, that's just a fact. That was 35 years of my life. We had a wonderful, loving relationship, so many memories, so many experiences. She's a part of me forever, and she helped make me the person I am. But I'm also fully engaged in the relationship I'm in now. I have found a way to have both of them simultaneously, which anyone who's lost a beloved partner and then gone on and fallen for someone else has to find a way to do, because you never stop grieving. The nature of your grief changes, and hopefully you learn to live with it, but you never stop grieving. The person you lost is still there in your heart. But now I have both of them.
That's wonderful. So you're very open and raw in talking about your grief, something that's not easy for a lot of men to express. First, why do you think that is? And second, what do you hope to encourage in other men through your book?
I'm going to take them backwards because I don't want to forget to answer what you just said. I hope that people reading this book, including especially men, will see for themselves the benefits that I gained by being openly emotional and by sharing so much with our friends. It's just there. I don't draw these things as a conclusion. I don't write paragraphs saying, you should be openly emotional. I just show you what it was like for me, and you get to see what the benefits are that I gained from it. And I do want to say, one of the most poignant moments that happened to me was during home hospice, when I was intimately involved with, I was helping to bathe Lynn, wipe her bottom as she couldn't do that anymore, all kinds of things. I was in the room with her the whole time, basically. One of the aides who has done hospice duty before many times told me how unusual it was for the husband to spend his time in the room with his wife. That often when she did home hospice, the husband would be in the other room because he couldn't bring himself to go and face the fact that his wife was dying in the bedroom, which was a terribly sad thought. So I know there's a real need for men to see and understand how much better it can be. But how the heck did I get to that spot? It starts actually way back at the beginning of our relationship, and this is in the book. From the very minute I met Lynn, she was encouraging me to talk about my feelings. So for the 30 years that I had known her before this journey started, she had been encouraging me to open up with her, just with her, not widely. Then we went through the 5 or 6 years with all of these twists and turns where she had these spinal operations. And several times she came home from a spinal operation with me, and I had to physically take care of her because during her recovery, at first, she couldn't do it herself. And I got used to the idea of helping to bathe her and wiping her bottom and things in these temporary periods following those surgeries. So on the one hand, she's encouraging me to be emotional, and on the other hand, life was putting me in a position where I was physically bathing and holding and comforting her and helping her in so many ways and cleaning up after her, after the messy accidents, because the book is full of the reality that there are lots of messy things that go on during these processes. And then finally, you have Caring Bridge, which I talked about before, where I was increasingly sharing my feelings. And I actually remember a turning point for me. A couple of years in, way before home hospice, I was at some kind of party filled with people I'd known for 20 or 30 years. And an old friend came up to me and said, "Tony, I love reading your Caring Bridge. I feel like I'm getting to know you for the first time," which kind of blew my mind because we had been friends for 30 years. But I was sharing on Caring Bridge a level of experience and emotion that you don't talk about in normal life, and I'd never had any reason to talk about. And that kind of encouragement, that sense that, oh, this is actually helping me get closer to my friends, was with me. So I think all of those things played a part in making me the person who I became by the time of hospice and by the time of writing the book.
Was there a time when you felt a level of exposure and vulnerability that was uncomfortable for you?
Exposed and vulnerable. Probably because I started getting the positive feedback so early in the process that I just got used to the idea and the reality of sharing my feelings, and our friends gave us so much support. Now, I will say, actually, the most exposed was after I met Cordelia. That's the name of the girlfriend. We call each other girlfriend. We're both in our 60s. That's the name of the woman I met and started to have a relationship with after Lynn died. And the most exposed was revealing to our friends that I was starting to see someone else when Lynn had only been gone for a few months. That terrified me. And the first time I wrote about it, in fact, I didn't write about it on Caring Bridge. I wrote posts about her for weeks in which I kind of masked the intensity of what was really going on. It was important in my life, so I talked about her, but I didn't say, I'm falling for this person. I might have an affair with her when she next comes to New York. She lived 1,000 miles away in Minneapolis. So I reached a point where I was at a museum with a couple of friends. We were on a line waiting to see a show at the museum, and I told them about Cordy. And one of them turned to me and said, "Tony, that's great. It's exactly what Lynn would have wanted," which you can just imagine the waves of relief that came over me. And then with that anecdote in mind, I started to write on Caring Bridge. In fact, I repeated that anecdote as part of my next Caring Bridge post. I started to open up about Cordy, but it was still really uncomfortable. And the first time we went to an art event, Lynn was a painter, I should say. She was an artist and had a gallery and had shows of her paintings. So the first time we went to an art opening with Lynn's paintings in it. It was a mini retrospective with her friends there. I really felt some of them were looking daggers at me and Cordy because they saw this as a betrayal. And others came up to me and said, Tony, this is what Lynn would have wanted. You're doing the right thing. All will be good in time. And so that was the period of my biggest exposure. And it was about my inner guilt, which I was definitely feeling of trying to start a new relationship, but the external guilt of people looking disapprovingly at me.
Wow, these are all really fascinating and interesting stories. I really appreciate you sharing all of those stories today. So as a final question today, again, your book is called Carrying the Tiger. Where can listeners get a copy of your book?
Carrying the Tiger is now available just about anywhere that you can order a book. Of course, it's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, bookshop.org, all those places. I should say it's available as in print, as an ebook, and as an audiobook narrated by me that you can get from Audible or Spotify or wherever you get your audiobooks. You can also learn a lot more. You can see samples of the book, things like that, on my website, which is TonyStewartAuthor.com. I've got videos there where I talk about it. I've got a clip of me reading from it and a lot of background information if you want to know more. Or just go to Amazon and click the buy button. I think that would be a really good idea.
And I encourage that too. Buy a copy of Tony's book, Carrying the Tiger. It's inspiring. I appreciate all the stories that he shared in the book and the short stories that he shared here today. So our guest has been new author, Tony Stewart. Thank you, Tony, for being here today.
You are very welcome. It was a real pleasure.
Please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things that we discussed today, including links to how you can get a copy of his book. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.